This study skills session is going to look at the philosophical skill of how to respond to a thought experiment. This will mostly be useful for people who are aged around 10 to 15 years old, studying the philosophy course on the Scholars Programme, but it could be also useful for people who are just more generally interested in philosophy or studying an arts or humanities course. The aims of this session are firstly to explain what a thought experiment is and why these are useful in philosophy, and secondly to explain how an argument, counter-argument and rebuttal can be used to respond to a thought experiment. The key words for the session will be philosophy, thought experiment, counter-argument and rebuttal. So firstly, we're going to have a look at the question of what is philosophy, because for many of you this will be a new subject area. It can be argued that philosophy is one of the oldest subjects in the world and that human beings have always been asking philosophical questions. Modern philosopher Peter Singer defines philosophy as the study of deep questions that science can't really answer. So, one of the things that makes these deep philosophical questions different to questions in other subjects is that they do not necessarily have a clear, definite, right or wrong answer. And this means that the answers to them cannot be proven in the same way that they can for non-philosophical questions. In other subjects, you might be able to look at a book or a textbook to find the answer to your question and find that people generally give the same answer, but that's not the case necessarily for philosophy. So having a look at these examples here, we can see that for our first question in the non-philosophical questions column, we've got a history question. What was the date on which World War II ended? Now, if you wanted to look up the answer to that question, you would be able to consult a book, look at a history textbook, for example, to find the answer, and you'd find that generally people agree and give the correct answer because they have evidence to back that up. Whereas looking at the philosophical question in the other column, when is waging war justified, that question doesn't necessarily have one clear answer. If you look at books and different people's opinions, you'll see that they disagree and have different ideas about how to answer that question. Again, looking back at the non-philosophical questions column, we can see that what is 5 multiplied by 5? There's a clear answer to that question. Whereas the question, are numbers just ideas? That is a philosophical question. Again, looking at our final example, the question, does human activity contribute to global warming? That's a question where scientists would be able to give an answer that's generally agreed upon, looking at measurements, experiments in the physical world. Whereas the question, should the Earth's resources be shared more equally? People could have different ideas about that. That's a philosophical question. So now we're going to have a look at one of the methods that philosophers use to answer these philosophical questions. This is the method of using a thought experiment. Now, non-philosophers carry out tests and experiments to help them test out their ideas and prove whether they are right or wrong. So, for example, a historian might examine a birth certificate that actually exists in the physical world in order to help them answer the question of when a historical figure was born. And a scientist might measure sea levels over time to check whether or not they are indeed rising. So philosophers can't carry out physical experiments like that because it's not possible to prove the answers to their philosophical questions using materials in the physical world around us. Instead, they carry out thought experiments that happen in their own mind. And this involves imagining what might happen in a scenario that is linked to a philosophical question. So this session today is all about getting you to learn how to respond effectively to one of these thought experiments. In order to do this, first of all, I'm going to go through an example thought experiment with you called the experience machine, and I'm going to model to you how you would respond to this effectively and the steps that you would take. Then you're going to have a go at doing this for a different thought experiment. So for this thought experiment, the experience machine, it was originally presented by philosopher Robert Nozick in 1974. And what I want you to do for this is imagine an experience machine exists that you can plug yourself into in order to always feel pleasure and never again feel suffering. In reality, your body would just be lying down, doing nothing, but your experiences would feel just as they would if they were real. For example, you could feel like you were eating ice cream, dancing to your favorite music, whatever brings you the most pleasure. But in fact, once you are plugged into this machine, you have to stay in the machine for the rest of your life. The question is, this philosophical question, should you plug yourself into the experience machine? When faced with a thought experiment such as this, philosophers respond by creating an argument, counter-argument, and rebuttal. This session will show you how to create each of these and so how to form your own effective response to a thought experiment. The first step that I recommend you take when developing your response to a thought experiment philosophical question such as this one is to write it in the middle of a mind map. And I want you to actually practice this now. So I want you to get a piece of paper in front of you and very shortly after I finish this explanation, pause the video and then draw out this mind map with the question in the middle and then all of your ideas for the yes side of how to answer this question on one side and then all of your ideas for the no side of how to answer this question on the other side. You'll notice that if you want a little bit of extra support with figuring out how to come up with ideas, there are some prompt questions here for you to use. So please do have a look at each of those prompt questions and use those to help you generate as many answers as possible if you would like that extra support. So please do now pause the video and take a few minutes to write out as many ideas as you can before I go through the examples with you. Now I'm going to go through with you the ideas that I came up with in my mind map for how to respond to this thought experiment. Remember, it's okay if your ideas are different to the ones that I came up with. That's totally fine because there's not just one clear answer to these philosophical questions. And actually, coming up with your own original ideas and forming new connections is a great way to increase your marks when responding to these kinds of questions. You'll see that on my mind map there were more ideas on the no side of the argument, and in my opinion, and again fine for you to have a different opinion, but in my opinion those arguments on the no side were stronger. So that's the side that I'll be leaning on when writing this up as a full essay later. One of the first ideas that I came up with is on the top right hand corner of the screen, which says that you would miss out on real life experiences going on in the actual world, including for your loved ones, if you were plugged into an experience machine. And you would never get to really be there for your family and friends or know what was really happening to them in their lives. So that was something that concerned me. And another point I had on the no side of the argument was that pleasure is not the most valuable thing in our lives, and in fact it is more rewarding to know that we are really growing, and that means going through negative experiences. However, I did come up with ideas on the yes side as well. So one of the things that I pointed out there was that pleasure is desirable and it's generally preferable to having negative experiences, at least on the surface for most people. So people who are living lives that involve particularly bad experiences could be especially tempted to plug themselves into the experience machine. Now what I'd like you to do is go back to your own mind map and underline or highlight key words that you've written that you feel could really support your argument. I've done an example of this on the next slide myself, so either you can have a go at this now or have a look at the example on the next slide first. Now on this slide I've put in bold the words that I think are really going to form the hinge points, so that means the key points of my argument. And you'll see that to start with I have done this for the word real here, the idea of reality being a really important factor for people's experiences. I've also done it for family and friends because that's quite a powerful thing for us to consider in our arguments. But then on the other side, the idea that having bad experiences could really affect people and potentially make them want to plug into the experience machine. And then finally, I've highlighted here the word growing, the idea that some kind of personal growth in life that is really valuable involves going through negative experiences as well as positive, pleasurable ones. So you should have now, for your own mind map, either highlighted or underlined the key words that you've come up with that you think would be really important when forming your argument. I'm now going to take you through the next step, which is all about developing these arguments further. And the first argument that we have to develop as philosophers answering a thought experiment question is our initial argument. So we're putting forward what side we're on and why for the first time. Now to do this, I've come up with this table, a point example explanation table, to help us develop our initial argument before we write it up into a paragraph. So the first point that I wanted to convey was linked to that keyword of real. And I wanted to say that it's not good enough just to have the feeling of an experience generally, because we want experiences to be real. And I came up with the example of, imagine that you had a choice between going on a fake adventure, you knew it was fake, but you had the simulation of feeling that it was real, or the choice of going on a real fun adventure. Now, I would say that we would generally want to go on a real fun adventure. We have that tendency to want it to be real because it makes things more meaningful. You'll also notice that I've put these ideas in red because that's the colour scheme that I'm going to be using when expressing our initial argument. I'll be using this same colour scheme when writing up the full paragraph version of how to respond to this answer, which you'll see later. Our initial argument outlined the no side for this position, but what we're going to look at now is the other side, so the yes response. So when doing this, we're going to be giving a counter argument, which means an argument against our original position. This is really helpful when responding to a thought experiment because it helps us to test out and develop our ideas, therefore allowing us to solve any problems that existed with our initial argument. You'll see that I've used blue as the colour scheme for the counter argument, and I'm just going to take you through these points now. You'll see that I have used the idea in bold from my previous mind map of people having particularly bad experiences in their lives. Those people might be more tempted to plug themselves into the experience machine, even though they know that in a sense it might not be as meaningful. For example, imagine if you didn't have a job that you enjoyed and in fact you didn't enjoy your job. Then you might want to plug yourself into the experience machine instead. And this could be a way to help you avoid and escape from a more difficult reality, because although the initial argument proposed the idea of people having fun adventures, some people that might not be applicable for them. Their lives might not involve that, and it's not necessarily that easy for everyone. So for them, it may be more tempting to plug into the experience machine. Our next step is then to give rebuttal, which is a reply to the counter-argument that defends our original position that was previously outlined in the initial argument. In this case, it points out what is wrong with the yes position and defends the no position in greater detail. You'll notice that I've used green as the colour scheme for the rebuttal, and then I've used purple as the colour scheme for the extension, and I'm going to go through that with you in a moment. The point that I've outlined is that, in fact, we need negative experiences in order to appreciate the things that give us happiness. And the lack of enjoyment from your job could actually make you appreciate more the things that you do enjoy. So, for example, being with family and friends, the most important things in life. Pleasure alone can therefore have limitations, so it's generally not worth giving up our real lives for pleasure just in itself. For the extension, what I've done is tried to really push the idea of what this reveals about human nature and come up with a kind of alternative, original idea about what's really valuable for human beings. And so I've outlined that in fact, the happiness that we should really pursue is more meaningful than that and could be called personal growth, because pleasure just in itself is not the most valuable thing. In fact, in life, we often feel the most satisfaction when we've had to overcome challenges and negative experiences, so that should be an important thing to be considered as part of personal growth. If you'd like to come up with your own PEE table for any of the ideas that you came up with in your mind map, then now could be a good time for you to pause the video and come up with a table like this for either an initial argument, counter-argument, or rebuttal, or a combination of those. If not though, then I'll be going through a full model answer in paragraphs on the next slide. You'll see that I have here written out a full answer to respond to this thought experiment, and I've used the colour scheme that I've outlined to you previously, but I've also added in an introduction to start with that outlines what the thought experiment is and the direction of argument that we will be taking very briefly. So you might want to pause the video now and read through this in more detail to give you a fuller understanding of how to write up your answer and your response to a thought experiment. Now it's your turn to have a go at writing up your own short essay, including an argument, counter-argument, and rebuttal in response to a different thought experiment. And to support you with this, we've created a worksheet which you'll see linked to in the description below this video. This thought experiment is here referred to as the problem of the ship of Theseus, and it makes us ask questions about the concept of identity, meaning thinking about who you are and what it means to be human. Philosophers first started studying this problem thousands of years ago in ancient Greece. For this thought experiment, I want you to imagine that there was a man called Theseus who had a ship that he used to sail around the world. Over the course of 10 years, old parts on this ship were gradually removed and replaced with new parts, until eventually the ship was made out of entirely new parts. This is ship A. Meanwhile, the old parts were being gradually pieced together and used to make another ship. This is ship B, which is made entirely out of the parts of the old ship. The question is, which one of these ships is the original ship? Are these ships the same? If you believe that ship B is the original ship, at what point did this happen? If 51% of the original parts were on ship B, then does that mean that it's the original ship at that point in time? What I'd now like you to do is use the worksheet provided to help you write an essay that includes an argument, counter-argument, and rebuttal in response to this key question from the thought experiment. Which of the ships is the original ship of Theseus? Ship A with the replaced parts, or ship B that was remade with the original parts? To support you with this, you might find it helpful to use a mind map or PEE table as you saw demonstrated previously. We'd also appreciate you completing the short survey linked to in the description below this video in order to assess your learning.